At 12:43 p.m., I drove to the estate with a lunchbox in my hand, thinking I was doing something kind for my wife. But before I could even call her name, I froze. A man placed his hand on her lower back and whispered, "After you." Then the cabin door closed behind them. Minutes later, the sounds inside told me everything my heart refused to believe. The lunchbox slipped from my hand, spilling across the grass. I don't remember driving home. I only remember one thought. I couldn't stay the same man after this. I'm so grateful you're here. Before we go any further, drop a comment and tell me where in the world are you watching from, your city, your state, your country. I want to know. It means everything to see this community come together from so many places. A quick note, this story contains fictional elements woven in for storytelling and educational purposes. Any similarity to names or places is coincidental, but the message it carries is one worth keeping. The cherry cabinet was done by 10:15. I stepped back and crossed my arms and looked at it the way I always do, head tilted just enough to catch the light across the surface. 3 weeks of work. Quarter sawn cherry from a mill up in Livingston grain, so tight you could read it like a fingerprint. The dovetails on the drawer boxes were clean. 2 coats of Danish oil hand-rubbed between each coat until the wood stopped drinking and started glowing. I pulled out my phone and called the customer in Cookville. "It's Hank Merritt," I said when he picked up. "Cabinet's done. You can come get it any time after noon tomorrow." "Already?" He sounded surprised. "I thought you said end of the month." "Wood cooperated," I said. "Finished this morning." A pause. "My wife is going to lose her mind. She's been talking about this thing for 6 months. Tell her the grain matched up better than I expected on the door panels," I said. "She'll want to know that." He laughed. "I'll tell her. You're a good man, Hank." I hung up and washed my hands at the utility sink, dried them on a shop rag, stood there looking at the cabinet one more time. That's when I smelled it drifting across the yard from the kitchen window Carol had cracked open. Sweet potato soup, buttermilk biscuits, and underneath it the deeper sweetness of pecan pie. Sunday pie. She only made it on Sundays, which told me she'd been in a particular kind of mood when she got up this morning. The baking mood, the kind that used to come more often. I walked inside and found a thermos on the counter lid, sealed, still warm to the touch. A paper bag beside it, 2 biscuits in foil, a slice of pie in a plastic container. I stood in the kitchen a moment. Something moved in me, slow and warm the way it does when a person does a small, kind thing without being asked. I wrapped the thermos in a dish towel, tucked the bag under my arm, and went out to the truck. The Silverado is a 2009 with 187,000 miles on the clock. Crack in the passenger windshield I've been meaning to fix for 2 years. Tailgate latch sticks in the cold. But the engine runs clean and the heater works, and on a Thursday morning in mid-October, with the ridge, country lit up orange and copper, and the sky that deep Tennessee blue that only shows up for 3 weeks a year, there's no place I'd rather be than behind that wheel, heading east on Route 70. 22 miles. I know every bend. Calvary Baptist went by on the left, the little white church with the hand-painted sign out front. That morning it read, "God sees everything." I'd driven past that sign so many times I'd stopped reading it years ago. I read it that morning without knowing why. Langford Estate came up after the last curve before the county line. White 4-board fence, Bradford pear trees lining the gravel drive, leaves turned bronze and gold in the October light. 300 acres of Smith County, Tennessee. The kind of place that looked like money without trying to, which is always the most expensive kind of look. I parked near the barrel storage building. The lot was quiet. A tractor sitting idle near the equipment shed. I grabbed the thermos and bag and walked out toward the east side picnic table where Carol usually took her lunch break. She wasn't there. I stood with the thermos in my hand and looked around the property. Wind moved through the vine rows. Somewhere in the barrel building, something metallic rang once and went quiet. I started walking north. The sourwood grove came through the tree line ahead of me, and behind it, the cabin. The sourwood trees were full color, deep red and burgundy leaves burning from the inside out. I walked through the edge of the grove boots, soft on the wet ground, and that's when I saw them. Carol and Garrett Langford walking toward the cabin from the south path, 40 yards ahead of me. I stopped, not a decision. My body just stopped the way it does when something in you understands something your brain hasn't caught up to yet. I'd seen Garrett Langford twice before, both times at winery events Carol dragged me to in the first year of her job. 55 years old, 6 feet up even, the kind of tan you get from working land, not a tanning bed. He was wearing a flannel shirt that probably cost more than my truck payment. His hand was on the small of Carol's back. Not the hand of a man steadying a colleague on uneven ground, the hand of a man touching what he considered his. Fingers relaxed, spread, settled in like they'd been there before and expected to be there again. Carol said something. I couldn't hear the words. Garrett leaned down toward her. His lips moved close to her ear, and she laughed. Not her polite laugh. Not the company party laugh I'd heard 1,000 times at events where she was tolerating people she didn't like. This was the other one. Low and open and real, the laugh that comes from somewhere a person doesn't perform. The laugh I hadn't heard her give me in years. And I couldn't have told you exactly how many years. If you'd asked me right then. Garrett's voice reached me as he pushed the cabin door open low. Easy, the tone of a man completely at home. After you. Carol stepped inside without hesitating. The door closed behind them. I stood in the sourwood shadows and didn't move. The cedar shake walls were thin. The October air was still. I don't need to describe what I heard. There are sounds that don't require explanation. Sounds that go straight past the ears and land somewhere in the chest, in the part of you that's been keeping the accounts of 30 years. And what they do there isn't anger, not yet. It's just a door closing on something you didn't know was still open. The lunch bag hit the ground. I watched it happen like I was watching someone else's hands. The bag twisted when it fell. The foil-wrapped biscuits tumbled out. The plastic container with the pecan pie landed face down in the red Tennessee clay. Sunday pie on a Thursday, because she'd been in a good mood this morning. The thermos stayed in my right hand. I couldn't let go. I stood one moment longer than I should have. Then I bent down, picked up the thermos, left everything else in the red clay, walked back through the sourwood trees the way I'd come in, back across the gravel lot, back to the Silverado. I got in, closed the door, set the thermos on the passenger seat, looked at the dashboard clock. 12:43. I sat in the truck with the engine off and stared at those numbers. I wasn't thinking. I couldn't think. I just sat there looking at 12:43 like it was the only real thing left in the world. I don't remember starting the truck. I remember being on Route 70, heading west with both hands on the wheel and the radio off and the windows up. The yellow center line appearing out of the ridge shadows, one broken stripe at a time, steady as a heartbeat. Caney Fork Bridge. Left on Millstone Road. The mailbox. The gravel drive. I pulled in at 1 o'clock and sat with the engine off for 17 minutes. Watched the clock go from 100 to 117. The truck ticked and cooled around me. A crow landed on the fence post by the garden, looked at me a while, left. I went inside. Stood in front of the open refrigerator for 4 full minutes without taking anything out. Closed it. Walked out to the shop. I stood in the middle of the shop floor and looked at the cherry cabinet. Still clean, still true, still the best work I'd done all month. The dovetails I'd spent a Tuesday afternoon getting exactly right. The finish I'd rubbed out with steel wool until it felt like touching still water. This morning it had meant something. A good morning. The kind that doesn't come often enough. Now it meant nothing at all. I picked up a hand plane I didn't need and set it back down. I sat on my shop stool, the one I built from white oak 20 years ago. The one with the left rear leg that wobbles slightly. In a way I keep meaning to fix, and I sat very still in the middle of my shop. At 6:15, I heard Carol's car on the gravel. I didn't move. "Hank," her voice from the kitchen, calm, ordinary. "Hank, you out there?" I didn't answer. 30 seconds of silence. Then the sound of the refrigerator opening. Cabinets. The quiet domestic sounds of a woman making dinner in a kitchen 20 feet from where her husband sat in the dark of his shop and said nothing. She didn't come out to find me. I sat in the shop until 8 o'clock. Then I went inside, ate the bowl of soup she'd left on the stove, washed the dish, and went to bed before she turned off the television. She was asleep by 10:30. I lay beside her until 11:30, flat on my back, listening to her breathe. Then I got up and went to the dining room. I built that table in 1996 from a white oak that came down in a storm on my father's land. Dried the wood 2 years before I touched it. I was 28 years old when I cut the first joint. When I put it together on the shop floor and set a level on the surface, and the bubble sat dead center, I stood there in the quiet and felt something I didn't have a name for at the time. 30 years in this room, 3 dogs, 2 trucks, 1 garage fire, 1 candle Carol knocked over in 1998 that left a scorch mark on the near corner she'd cried and called it ruined, and I'd taken a piece of fine sandpaper and worked the mark down to a shadow, barely visible in certain light, and said, "It's okay, it's just wood." She'd looked up at me from the floor where she was still kneeling, eyes red. "How are you never upset about anything?" I hadn't known how to answer that. I just handed her the sandpaper. I sat down at the table in the dark and put both hands flat on the surface. Ran my palms along the grain, every ripple, every repair. Every year I'd kept it without anyone asking me to. Who was I this morning? I tried to find him. The man who'd wrapped the thermos in the dish towel and driven east on Route 70 with nothing in his mind but a small kindness. He'd been real at 10:15. Real when he called Cookville and said the wood cooperated. Real when he smelled the pecan pie from across the yard and felt something warm move in his chest. Was he still in this room? I sat with that question for a long time. At 2 in the morning, Brynn's name surfaced in my mind. 29 years old. Events coordinator at Langford Estate. 8 months. She'd called us both when she got the job. I remembered her voice, on the phone, that particular pride she gets when she's done something entirely on her own. "Dad, it's a real operation out there. 300 acres. The owner really knows what he's doing." "You like it out there?" I'd asked. "I love it. It feels like something's actually happening, you know? Like I'm part of something." I told her I was proud of her. I'd meant it. Now I sat in the dark with my hands on the oak table and felt something move at the edge of my mind. Not a thought yet, not a name, just a shape. The way you feel a knot in a board before the light is good enough to see it clearly. I went back to bed at 3, lay down beside Carol, looked up at the ceiling. Outside, the October dark was absolute and quiet. Inside, the sound of her breathing slow and even, the deep rhythm of someone who had no idea the floor had just dropped out. I lay there until the bedroom windows went from black to gray. When Carol's alarm went off at 6, I was already in the kitchen with the coffee maid. She came in, hair still down, and poured herself a cup. "Morning," she said. "Morning," I said. She sat across from me at the table. Not the oak table, the small kitchen table. And we ate eggs and toast and talked about nothing. The weather, the Cookville delivery, whether the gutters needed cleaning before winter. She looked at me once, something crossing her face. Not guilt exactly, more like a person checking whether a door they left unlocked has been noticed. I gave her nothing to read, and I started counting. Counting turned out to be easier than I expected. I drove into town the next morning on the pretense of a lumber run 2x6s for a fence repair I'd been putting off since September. Dollar General was on the way. I pulled into the lot, parked, and sat a moment before going in. The fluorescent lights in that store have always made everything look slightly wrong. Too pale, too flat. I walked past the cleaning supplies and found the school section near the back. Composition notebook. Brown cover, 88 cents. I stood there holding it and asked myself what exactly I thought I was doing. The answer came the way answers come when you work with your hands long enough, not in words, but in instinct. 30 years of woodworking had taught me one thing above all else: before you cut, you measure. Before you build, you document. Before you make a move you can't take back, you know exactly what you're working with. I took the notebook, added 2 pens and a styrofoam coffee from the machine by the door. The woman at the register scanned my items without looking up. "Cold out there today." "Getting there," I said. "You need a bag." "No, ma'am." I paid cash and went back to the truck. Sat in the parking lot with the notebook open on my knee and wrote the date at the top of the first page. October 17th, 2025. Then I wrote down everything from the day before time of arrival at the estate, where I parked the walk north, through the vine rows, the sourwood grove, the time on the cabin door closing. What I heard through the cedar shake walls. The time I got back to the truck, 12:43. I wrote it the way I wrote job estimates. No emotion, just sequence. What happened when it happened, in what order. When I finished yesterday, I turned the page and started on the past month. The jasmine perfume that showed up in August. She'd never worn jasmine before, not in 30 years. The blue drugstore bottle she'd used since the 90s had been replaced by something darker and more expensive, applied twice every morning, once before putting on her jacket, once right at the door. The phone calls taken outside on the back porch. The texts read and deleted immediately. The evenings she came home with her hair slightly different from how it looked when she left. I wrote it all down. My handwriting looked like the handwriting of someone trying to keep their hand from shaking. I wrote anyway. That night, Carol told me about a new tasting event Langford was planning for November. I said it sounded nice. She said Garrett had a real vision for the place. I said I was sure he did. She looked at me a half second longer than usual. Then she passed me the salt. The next morning, before she left, I wrote down the number on her odometer. She left at 7:34. 14 minutes earlier than usual, I stood at the kitchen window and watched the taillights of her Camry disappear around the bend on Millstone Road. Then I went out to where her car had been parked and wrote down the odometer, reading from memory. I'd checked it the night before while she was watching television, leaned in through the unlocked driver's door, noted the number without being asked about it. I did this every morning for 5 days. Day 1, 47 miles over the round-trip distance from our house to Langford Estate. Day 3, 31 miles over. Day 5, 52 miles over. The numbers were never the same, which ruled out a consistent detour. The variation told me the extra miles were purposeful and flexible, the kind of miles you put on a car when you're going somewhere that doesn't have a fixed schedule. One evening that week, she was getting ready in the bedroom for what she called a vendor dinner. I came in and stood in the doorway. She was at the mirror back to me, and I watched her apply the jasmine perfume once, then a pause, then once more. She was looking at herself the way a person looks when they're checking something internal. A silent conversation with herself I wasn't part of. "You look nice," I said. She startled, not much, just a slight shift in her shoulders. "I didn't hear you come in. Didn't mean to sneak up on you." She turned back to the mirror and adjusted an earring. "I won't be late. There's leftover chicken in the fridge." "I'll manage," I said. I watched her a moment. She kept her eyes on her reflection, doing the small, busy things a person does when they want to appear occupied. Something pressed up against the inside of my chest. Not quite anger, yet not quite grief. Something with no name I knew. "Carol," I said. She met my eyes in the mirror. 4 words sat right on the front of my tongue. I held them there 1 full second. Then I said, "Drive safe." She picked up her purse. I always do. She was home by 9:45. I lay in bed and kept my breathing slow and even when she slid in beside me. The next morning, I pulled the bank statements from the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet in the shop. I spread 3 months of statements across the workbench under the shop light and read them the way I read wood, looking for where the pattern breaks, where something that should run straight has turned, where the grain has moved in a direction it wasn't supposed to. It took 40 minutes to find the first one. $2,000. November of last year. Transferred to an account number I didn't recognize. Not a bill payment, not a vendor, nothing labeled. Just a transfer clean and quiet to a string of digits that meant nothing to me. I went back further. Pulled every statement going back 11 months. $3,500 in January, $4,200 on a Tuesday in July. Amounts always large enough to matter, but never quite large enough to feel alarming in isolation. The kind of numbers that slip past when you're not looking for them specifically. I added them up 3 times. $99,000. I sat on the shop stool and looked at that number. The shop was quiet. The October night pressed against the windows. A dog barked somewhere down the road and stopped. $99,000. Gone from a joint account in pieces over 11 months. Gone somewhere I couldn't follow. I stayed very still. Then I went to the back of the shop, removed 4 screws from a section of wall paneling, moved the filing cabinet forward, and opened the small floor safe behind it. Inside, a manila envelope with 3 U.S. patents, 2018, 2020, 2022, for a wood joinery technique I'd developed over 15 years of custom work. And underneath the patents, a letter from a Nashville furniture company dated March 2023. $380,000 for a licensing agreement I hadn't answered yet. Carol didn't know any of it existed. I put the envelope back, locked the safe, replaced the paneling, sat back down on the stool, picked up my phone. Buddy picked up on the second ring. His porch light was on when I pulled in at 8. He met me at the door in flannel and the kind of face that said he already understood this wasn't a social visit. Earl Dawson, buddy to everyone who knew him before he turned 30, had been deputy sheriff of Smith County for 21 years. He was 61, built solid, with the particular stillness of a man who had absorbed every version of bad news without being broken by any of it. He'd retired to 40 acres and Black Angus cattle, and his kitchen smelled like wood smoke and coffee. 2 glasses of Jim Beam were already on the table. I sat down. He sat across from me, poured, and didn't say a word, just waited. So I told him everything: the Sourwood Grove, the cabin, the odometer readings, the $99,000. I told him in order without asking for anything, the same way I'd written it all in the composition notebook. When I finished, Buddy reached across the table and flipped over a manila folder that had been sitting face down beside the salt shaker. He slid it to me. "I wondered when you'd call," he said. I looked at him. "That black F-150 has been parking up the road from your house," he said. "Registered to Langford Estate. 3 times in 6 weeks, always on days you were making deliveries. I've been watching." I opened the folder. 23 pages. Garrett Langford, 55 years old, $6.2 million in assets, $3.8 million in mortgage. 2 prior marriages, both settled outside court with NDS. A harassment complaint filed in Kentucky in 2019, withdrawn after a confidential payment. A state investigation into winery licensing in 2022 closed without action. I turned the pages slowly. Buddy drank and let me read. "He's done this before," I said. Not a question. "At least 8 women in 12 years, Buddy said. Every single one had some connection to property or assets he wanted access to." I set the folder down. "Carol has 3 acres on the deed. Land from my father." "I know. He's not interested in Carol." The words came out flat, like I was reading off a page. "Not really." Buddy looked at me steady. "No, he's not interested in anyone. He's interested in what they have." I held my glass without drinking. The kitchen clock ticked. Outside, cattle moved in the dark. "There's something else," I said. Buddy waited. "Brynn works out there. 8 months." The silence that followed lasted exactly long enough for me to know he'd already thought of it. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I know." I drank the Jim Beam, looked at the 23 pages. Something in my chest had been shifting all night, moving from grief towards something colder and harder and more useful. "I need to know exactly what I'm dealing with before I do anything," I said. "All of it. I'm not cutting a board until I know where the grain runs." "Smart aleck," Buddy said. He refilled my glass. "You got a lawyer. I'll get one. Beverly Grayson Carthage. Handled my cousin's estate. Doesn't oversell, doesn't lose." He set the bottle down. "Don't call her from your house phone." "I won't." I drove home at 10:30. Carol was asleep. I stood on the back porch in the dark for a long time, thinking about Brynn the way she'd said his name on the phone 8 months ago, bright with the particular excitement of someone who believes they've found something real. I stood there until the cold worked all the way through my jacket. Then I went inside. I didn't sleep, but I knew what I had to do next. Loretta Finch had lived across the road from us for 19 years. 71 years old, a widow sharp as a finish nail and twice as straight. She had 2 fat tomcats named after country singers, and a memory like a court recorder. She noticed everything on Millstone Road not out of nosiness, but out of the particular attentiveness of a woman who had lived alone long enough that the rhythm of her neighbors' days had become a kind of quiet company. I knocked on her door on Monday morning and said I needed to borrow a pair of lineman's pliers. She looked at me over her reading glasses for exactly 1 second. "Come in," she said. "I just made a fresh pot." We sat at her kitchen table. She put shortbread on a plate between us and poured 2 cups without asking. We talked about the weather and her granddaughter starting high school and the new stop sign at the end of the road that nobody was stopping at. Then I said, "Loretta, have you noticed any unusual traffic on the road lately? Vehicles you don't recognize?" She set her cup down and looked at me with her clear gray eyes. "Hank," she said, "how long have we been neighbors?" 19 years. "And in 19 years have I ever struck you as the kind of woman who doesn't know what's happening on this road?" "No, ma'am," I said. "That's exactly why I'm asking." She got up, went to the roll-top desk in the corner of the living room, and came back with a small desk calendar, the kind with 1 page per day. She opened it on the table in front of me and pointed without sitting down. Blackford F150, Smith County plates. I wrote it down because it parked up the road, not in a driveway, just sat there. She tapped the page. September 3rd. That was a Tuesday. You were delivering to Murfreesboro. I saw you load the truck that morning. She turned to another page. September 18th. Wednesday. You were at the lumberyard in Carthage all day. Another page. October 7th. You'd gone to pick up the cherrywood the Livingston run. I took out my notebook and wrote down all 3 dates. My hand was steady. I was proud of that. She watched me write. When I looked up, her expression had changed softer now, something in it that felt like 19 years of paying attention. Loretta, I started. Don't thank me, she said. She reached across and put her hand briefly over mine, firm, certain the touch of someone skipping past ceremony. Just tell me you're being careful. I'm being careful. Good. She picked up her cup. Now, do you actually need those pliers? Despite everything, I almost smiled. I'll take the pliers. I drove home with 3 dates written in my notebook, and a feeling I couldn't quite name somewhere between gratitude and something that ached. Garrett Langford had been outside my house 3 times. He had parked up the road and watched the property of a man he'd never met, whose wife he was sleeping with, whose daughter he was manipulating. And now I had a 71-year-old woman with a desk calendar who had written it all down. Gene Whitaker came Wednesday morning to pick up a set of cabinet doors. We loaded them into his truck bed and stood in the shop doorway afterward the way men do when neither is ready to leave, and the morning is still early. He turned his gas station coffee cup in his hands and looked at the floor. Hank, he said, I need to tell you something about Cody. I waited. He's been out at Langford Estate since May. Good work for him gets him outside, gives him some money. About 3 weeks ago, Curtis Aldridge, that's Langford's personal assistant, big fella, he came up to me at the hardware store in Carthage. Real friendly. Too friendly. Gene's jaw tightened. He said, and these were his exact words, Cody's a good worker. Garrett appreciates loyal people. Loyalty goes a long way with a man like Garrett. Just something to keep in mind. Not technically a threat, I said. No, not technically. Gene looked up. But every man in this county knows what that kind of talk means. What's Cody been like since? Quiet. Before that, he'd come home and tell me things, small things, who he saw what was happening up there. Now, nothing. Won't talk about the estate at all. Gene met my eyes. I don't know what that boy saw, but he saw something. I leaned against the doorframe. The morning was cold, and still a low white sky sitting heavy on the ridge. Gene, I said, I'm not going to pretend I don't understand what you're telling me. He nodded once. Would Cody be willing to come here and talk, not about anything specific yet, just sit in this shop and have a conversation? Gene was quiet a moment, looked out at the driveway, then back at me. If I tell him it's you, he said slowly, and if I tell him you'll make sure nothing comes back on our family, then yeah, I think he would. I looked at Gene Whitaker, 8 years of lumber orders and fair dealings, and now this, a man asking me to protect his son with nothing but my word. Nothing is going to happen to your family, I said. You have my word on that. He held my eyes a moment. Then he nodded, picked up the last cabinet door, and carried it to his truck. He loaded it carefully. Before he got in the cab, he turned back one more time. Be careful with this man, Hank. He's got money, and he's used to winning. I know, I said. So do I. Mine just looks different. He drove out. I stood in the shop doorway and watched until his truck was gone. I needed to talk to Cody. But first I needed to know where I stood, legally exactly where, down to the inch. There was a woman in Carthage named Beverly Grayson who had handled my father's estate without fuss or false promises. I went inside, found her number in the back of the composition notebook, and called her from my cell phone standing in the middle of the shop floor. She picked up on the third ring. Beverly Grayson? Bev, it's Hank Merritt. You handled my father's estate back in 2019. The Oakland in Smith County. A brief pause. I remember you. No will, 2 siblings, 4 months to untangle. Another pause. You don't sound like a man calling about a routine matter. No, ma'am, I said. I'm not. Then tell me what you've got. I gave her the outline of the situation with Carol, the $99,000, the house title, a Nashville attorney named Miriam Tuck. I'd learned about through a channel I didn't want to explain over the phone. I kept it factual and short. When I finished, she was quiet exactly 3 seconds. Come see me tomorrow, 2 o'clock. Don't discuss any of this with Carol before we talk. Don't move money, don't change passwords, don't do anything reactive. A pause. Whose name is on the house title right now? I closed my eyes briefly. Carol's, after the refinance in 2019. The silence that followed had weight to it. Come at 2, she said. Don't be late. Her office was in a 2-story brick building on the Carthage Square. Old paperwood polish, 40 years of difficult conversations absorbed into the walls. She had a legal pad out when I sat down. All of it this time, she said. So I told her everything, the composition notebook, the odometer readings, the Sourwood Grove, Buddy's folder, the 99,000, the patents in the safe, Loretta's desk calendar, Jean Whitaker and Cody, 40 minutes without stopping. She wrote without looking up. When I finished, she set her pen down. Miriam Tuck was retained 14 weeks ago. That's early August. Carol started at Langford Estate 8 months ago, I said. She started planning the exit 6 months in, Bev said evenly. The legal strategy began when she decided she had what she needed. She folded her hands. The house title concerns me most. The 2019 refinance, walk me through it. Who initiated it? Who handled the paperwork? Where were you when you signed? I thought back. December 2018, knee surgery, meniscus repair, 6 weeks off my feet. Carol handled the refinance paperwork, brought documents to the house. I'd been 2 days out of a follow-up procedure, still on medication, signing whatever she put in front of me because I trusted her, and the room tilted when I tried to focus. Bev stopped writing, looked up slowly. You were under post-surgical anesthesia medication when you signed a power of attorney. I didn't know that's what I signed. I know. She circled something on the pad twice. That document may not be legally valid. A signature obtained while someone is impaired by anesthesia recovery medication, there's significant precedent for challenging it. She stood signaling the end of the meeting. Don't tell Carol about this conversation. Continue exactly as you have been. At the door, the patents, the licensing offer, don't touch them. Don't answer that letter. Don't move those documents. That money doesn't exist yet, which means it can't be claimed as marital property. I nodded and walked out into the November afternoon. I drove home and sat in the driveway, looking at the house, 22 years of work. 4 coats of paint, the front porch I'd rebuilt from scratch in 2014. Standing in Carol's name. I sat there a long time before going in. I waited until Carol drove to Cookville to see her sister. She left at 9:15. I gave it 10 minutes, then went to the bedroom and stood in the middle of the floor. I want to be clear. I am not a man who goes through other people's things. In 30 years of marriage, I had never opened Carol's phone, never looked at her mail, never searched through her belongings, not once. But I was no longer operating under the assumption that 30 years meant what I thought it meant. I started at the top of the closet and worked down left to right methodical, the same way I'd search a shop for a misplaced tool. 2 unworn hats, a Christmas ornament box, a sweater in a plastic bag. In the back corner of the top shelf behind 2 winter hats she hadn't touched since last season. A round hatbox blue, the kind department stores used decades ago. Inside, nested in tissue paper, a small notebook with a blue cover. Her handwriting on the first page, March 14th, 2024. 6 months before she took the job at Langford Estate. I sat on the edge of the bed and read. It was meticulous. A financial inventory, our joint assets, individual assets, estimated values, liquidation timelines. My income was listed, analyzed, and questioned in the margin with one word stable. Our home was valued at $460,000. The 3 acres from my father were listed with a note deed, research needed. Then a section titled Process Attorney, Consultation, Asset Documentation, Timeline to Filing. Under timeline, 12 to 18 months from initiation. I turned to the last written page. Near the bottom in handwriting, slightly looser than the rest, written quickly, maybe late at night, he is the exit. I sat on the edge of the bed and held the notebook and understood something I had been halfway understanding for 3 weeks. Carol hadn't fallen into this. She had walked toward it deliberately with a plan and a timeline, and a man she'd identified as the vehicle. I photographed every page, replaced the notebook exactly as I'd found it, tissue paper, folded the same way, lid at the same angle, put it back on the shelf, left the room, went to the shop, picked up a hand plane and ran it across a scrap of pine for no reason, except that my hands needed something to do. When Carol came home at 4, I asked how her sister was doing, and she said fine, and I said good. We ate dinner. I washed the dishes. That night I lay in the dark and did not let myself think about March 14th, 2024, until I heard her breathing slow into sleep. It was a Sunday. Carol had gone shopping with Wanda. I was changing the sheets. I pulled the fitted sheet off her side, moved her pillow, and something slid off the nightstand and landed on the carpet with a soft thud. A Samsung. Older model black case. Not her regular phone. I picked it up. Pressed the side button. No lock screen, just a home screen, and a text icon with 43 unread messages. I set it on the nightstand, stood there looking at it. You don't have to do this, Hank. But a man who measures twice doesn't put the tape away because he's afraid of what the number might be. I plugged it in and sat on the bed and opened the messages. The thread at the top had no name, just a number. 8 months of messages. I scrolled without reading at first, just getting the shape of it, frequency, tone pattern. Then I slowed down. I read through September carefully. Near the end of a long thread from the 3rd week of that month, I found it. Carol had written, "He had lunch out at the shop again today, just puttering around like always. Hank doesn't know anything. He never does." I set the phone face down on the nightstand, stood up, walked through the kitchen and out the back door, and stood on the porch with my hands loose at my sides. The sky was gray concrete. The yard was still. The bare trees at the back of the property stood stripped of everything soft. Hank doesn't know anything. He never does. 30 years. I had built this woman a table from a tree that had been alive for a century and a half. I had driven to the ER at 2 in the morning when she had a kidney stone and sat in that waiting room for 6 hours with bad coffee. I had repainted this house twice and rebuilt the porch and fixed every door that stuck and replaced every pipe that leaked. And not once had I done any of it as an obligation. Every one of those things had been a choice. He never does. I stood on that porch until the cold was all the way through my jacket. Then I went back inside, photographed every relevant message, put the phone back exactly where it fell, finished changing the sheets, went to the shop and picked up my sharpest chisel and honed the blade on the whetstone until the edge was clean and precise and capable. It was the only thing I could do with my hands right then that wouldn't damage something I needed. That evening, Carol came home and told me about Wanda's kitchen renovation, and I asked the right questions, and she never once looked at me like a woman who suspected anything at all. Buddy called on a Friday afternoon while I was fitting a drawer box. "Got something from Howard Bliss," he said. No greeting. "Who is he?" Was Langford's financial manager until September. Got pushed out after a disagreement about what he called unclassified expenditures. He talked not on record, not yet, but he talked. I set the drawer box down and picked up the composition notebook. "Go ahead." "Langford has been running the same pattern for 12 years, Buddy said. At least 8 women. Every single one connected to an asset land property access a business arrangement that he wanted. He doesn't pursue women because he's attracted to them. He pursues them because they're attached to something he wants." "The 3 acres, I said. "Your father's 3 acres, plus winery access Carol had through her employee agreement. Land use permissions that would be valuable if Garrett wanted to expand the eastern boundary of the estate." Paper shuffled. "There's more. Howard says Garrett specifically looks for situations where there's a second target, a daughter, a niece, someone younger he can develop a parallel relationship with. Creates leverage, creates confusion, makes both targets less likely to compare notes because the relationship between them gets complicated." The shop went quiet around me. "Brynn," I said. "Howard didn't know names, but the pattern fits." I looked at my hands. Sawdust in the knuckle creases. 30 years of work written into those lines. "He planned this before Carol ever started working there," I said. "That's what Howard believes," Buddy said. "He found the target first, then created the opportunity." I sat with that a moment. The drawer box on the workbench, half finished, forgotten. "Buddy," I said, I need to see what's on Cody Whitaker's USB before I do anything else. I figured, he said. I'll make a call. I sat in the shop after I hung up and looked at nothing for a long time. This was not a story about a wife who strayed. This was a story about a man who had selected my family as a target and spent months positioning himself to take everything he could reach. And my daughter was in that building 5 days a week believing she had found something real. He came Tuesday evening after dark, driving slow and watching his mirrors. I'd left the shop light on and the side door cracked. He parked at the far end of the driveway. Right instinct, and came in with his collar up and his hands not quite still. Cody Whitaker was 18 and looked it in the face, but not in the eyes. "Mr. Merritt," he said. "Cody, sit down. You want coffee?" "No, sir." He sat across from me and kept his jacket on. "I've wanted to say something since August, but after Curtis talked to my dad, I didn't know who I could trust." "Curtis Aldridge." "Yes, sir, didn't threaten us directly, but the way he talked—" He shook his head. "My dad understood it. I understood it." "I know what that kind of talk sounds like," I said, "and I meant what I told your father. Nothing comes back on your family." He looked at me the way a young person looks when they're deciding whether an adult is telling the truth or just managing them. Whatever he saw, it was enough. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a USB drive, set it on the workbench between us. 17 photos, he said. 3 videos. I took them over 6 weeks starting in August, transferred everything to the drive and deleted it off my phone. He paused. "I didn't know your daughter was involved until October when she brought in a family photo and put it on her desk. When I saw it..." He stopped. I felt sick. "What do the photos show?" I asked. "First ones are Mrs. Merritt and Mr. Langford at the cabin. Clear time-stamped. The later ones..." He looked at the workbench. "There's another woman, younger, dark hair, events office." I picked up the drive. It weighed almost nothing. "Cody," I said, "what you did tonight took real courage." He shook his head like he wanted to reject the word. I just couldn't keep sitting on it anymore. "That's exactly what courage is," I said. "When sitting on something becomes more unbearable than doing something about it." I walked him to the door and watched his truck ease down Millstone Road. Then I went back to the shop and stood in front of the workbench with the drive in my hand. I looked at it a long time before I walked to the computer. I plugged in the drive and opened the first file. I went in order. Methodical. Not because I didn't feel anything, but because feeling everything at once would have made it impossible to see clearly. And seeing clearly was the only thing I could afford right now. The first 4 photographs were of Carol and Garrett, the Sourwood Grove, the gravel path north of the cabin, time stamped clear, unambiguous. I had known these existed in some form. Seeing them confirmed what I'd been confirming for weeks. I kept moving. File 5. Brynn and Garrett on the cabin porch, late September afternoon. The vine rose behind them, going gold in the autumn light. His hand around hers on the railing. She was looking up at him with the expression of a young woman who believes she is being truly seen for the first time by someone who matters. Her face was turned slightly toward the light without knowing it. She was smiling. I zoomed in. She looked like Carol at 29. She looked like the girl I'd driven to the ER at 19 when she fractured her wrist. The girl who had called me from 3 different cities, over 3 job changes, the girl who had slept on our couch for 2 months after the engagement ended and cried every night until she stopped. She looked like my daughter. She looked like someone being hunted by a man who had been doing this for 12 years and knew every step of the process by heart. I went through the remaining files, steady, methodical. I didn't let myself stop until I'd seen all of them. The 3rd video I closed at 45 seconds. I had enough. I ejected the drive, put it in my shirt pocket, stood up. Then I walked out the back door of the shop into the November night. The cold hit me like a hand on the chest. I walked to the fence at the far end of the yard and put both hands on the top rail and stood there in the dark. I had been patient for 3 weeks. I had measured and documented and built my case one piece at a time the way I'd build anything that needed to last. And all of that had been right, and I would continue doing it. But standing at that fence in the November dark, I felt something move through me that had nothing to do with patience. Cold, calcifying rage, the kind that settles into the joints and becomes structural. I gripped the fence rail until my knuckles ached. Let the cold work all the way through me. Let it find its level and its shape the form it needed to be useful rather than destructive. 20 minutes. Then I went back inside. I made 2 backup copies of every file, locked them both away, and sat at the kitchen table in the dark, with a cup of coffee, and thought about how to tell my daughter. There was no clean way to do it. There was only the truth in the right order at the right time. Travis called on a Thursday evening while I was eating dinner alone. "Hey, Dad." His voice was too careful. "Travis." I set my fork down. "What's going on?" A pause. "Mom called me again, 3 times this week." "I know. She's saying things I don't know what to do with. About you." He stopped, then pushed through it. "That you've been withdrawn. That you're drinking more than usual. That she's worried about your mental state." Another pause. "Dad, I know you. It doesn't sound like you, but she sounds pretty convinced." Something hot moved up through my chest. I pressed it back down. Not at Travis. Carol had called her son 3 times in 1 week with a consistent, careful story, and he was doing what a decent son does. He was asking. "Travis," I said, "in your entire life, have you ever seen me take more than a beer at a cookout?" "No." "Have I ever been anything other than exactly what I appear to be?" "No, Dad." "Then I need you to hold on to what you know," I said. "I can't explain everything right now, but I'm asking you to hold on to what's true about me, and not let anyone replace it with something that isn't. Can you do that?" "Yeah," he said, then quieter. "Do you want me to come down?" I looked around the kitchen. Dinner for 1, the empty chair, the house in someone else's name. "Not yet," I said, "but soon. When I need you, I'll call. And when I call, I need you to come fast." "I'll be there," he said. No hesitation. After I hung up, I wrote in the notebook, November 15th. Carol using Travis as groundwork. Building the narrative. Document everything. Then I finished my dinner cold by then, because a man who stops eating when the food gets cold isn't thinking straight. Roy Tatum pulled into my driveway on a Tuesday morning with the particular discomfort of a man about to say something he wishes he didn't have to. I met him at the shop door. "Roy, come in. I won't stay long." He took off his cap, turned it in his hands. "Hank, my wife, got something in the church women's chat group last week. A photograph of your shop, taken from the road by the angle." He met my eyes. "The caption said you'd been struggling, that you'd been drinking heavily, that people should pray for Carol." I waited. "The photo was real," he said. "The caption wasn't." Something settled in my chest, cold and precise. "Who sent it?" I asked. "New number, forwarded from someone else." By the time my wife asked about it, the original sender had left the group. He put his cap back on. "I've been your doctor 12 years, Hank. I've never seen you drink more than a beer at the 4th of July. I didn't believe it for a second." "I know you didn't," I said, "but I'm glad you came." He started for his truck, stopped, turned around. "This is bigger than a divorce, isn't it?" It wasn't a question. "Yeah," I said, "it is." He nodded and drove away. I sat on the shop stool and opened the notebook. Wrote November 18th. Reputation campaign confirmed. Photo of shop distributed through church group chat. Caption fabricated. Coordinated. Carol is not just preparing a legal exit, she is preparing a social one. Then I turned to a new page and made a list of everything Carol had done since March 2024. The notebook. The 99,000. Miriam Tuck. Lyle Prudhomme. Travis. The church group. She had been 3 steps ahead of me the whole time. I closed the notebook. Then I thought, not anymore. Bev called at 8:15 on a Friday morning. I was in the kitchen, second coffee, watching the frost on the backfield catch the early light. Carol had left at 7:41. "Hank," Bev's voice had an edge I hadn't heard before. "Are you sitting down?" "Tell me," I said. "Your house went up on Zillow and Realtor.com this morning. Listed at $485,000. Listing agent is Lyle Prudhomme out of Lebanon. Closing date December 15th. A pause. "There's a preliminary offer already in. Without a freeze on the asset, within 72 hours, Carol can legally proceed. She has the title, she has the agent, she has an offer." The frost on the backfield blurred for a moment and came back sharp. "Hank, is there anything you haven't told me that could complicate what I'm about to do?" "No," I said. "You have everything." "Then I'm filing for the freeze today. Come in this afternoon, 1 o'clock, sign some papers." Her voice softened 1 degree barely, but I caught it. "And don't call Carol. Don't mention the listing. Act like you don't know." After I hung up, I stood in the kitchen and looked at the room around me. The cabinets I'd built in 2016, from reclaimed barnwood. The window over the sink I'd reframed after the rot took the sill. The back door I'd rehung twice to get the swing exactly right. 22 years of work, in someone else's name. 72 hours from being gone. I pressed both palms flat on the counter and breathed. Then I picked up the phone again. There was one more person I needed, someone who had been watching from inside the estate and trying to find the right door to knock on. Gene Whitaker had passed me a name 2 weeks before. I'd been sitting on it, waiting for the right moment. The right moment was now. I found the number in the back of the composition notebook, looked at it a long time. Then I dialed. He showed up that evening without calling first. I heard the truck on the gravel, a Tacoma well-maintained, and watched through the shop window as a man in his late 20s got out and stood in the driveway looking at the shop. Lean, dark work jacket, the build of someone who spent his days outdoors doing actual labor. He held himself straight without being rigid. I opened the shop door before he could knock. "Mr. Merritt?" He held my gaze without flinching. "You're Noah Slade." "Yes, sir." A beat. "I know I should have called. I was afraid you'd say no." I looked at him a moment, something straightforward in his face. The kind of straightforward that doesn't come from inexperience, but from having decided to be honest, even when honesty costs something. "Come in," I said. He stepped inside and looked around the shop with genuine attention, reading the tools, the projects, the order of things. A working boy reading another working man's space. "I tried to talk to Brynn in September," he said, turning to face me. "Told her I thought something was wrong. That Garrett had a pattern." He paused. "She said I was jealous. That I didn't understand what kind of man Garrett was." "Were you jealous?" I asked. He didn't flinch from it. "Yes, and I was also right. Both things were true, and she only heard one of them." I almost respected that answer. "She wasn't wrong about your feelings," I said. "She was wrong about what that meant." "Exactly." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, handwritten notes, dates and times locations. "I've been watching that estate for 8 months. I manage the vineyard. I'm in places Curtis Aldridge doesn't know about and doesn't think to watch." He set the paper on the workbench. "I didn't know who to bring this to. I knew if I went to law enforcement it would get back to Garrett before anything moved. I knew Carol wasn't an option." "Carol isn't an option," I confirmed. "Gene Whitaker told me you were the right person." He looked at me steadily. I hope he was right. I gestured to the stool. "Sit down, I'll make coffee." He sat. I started the coffee. The shop was warm and the November night pressed against the windows, and I had a particular feeling, the feeling that comes when separate pieces, gathered in isolation, finally begin to occupy the same space. The feeling that something is about to become what it was always going to be. I set a cup in front of him and pulled my stool close. "Noah," I said, "tell me what you've got." He unfolded the paper on the workbench. 8 months of everything. He looked up. "Where do you want to start?" I opened the composition notebook to a fresh page, uncapped my pen. "Start at the beginning," I said. "I've got time." Noah talked for 2 hours that night. By the time his truck pulled out at 11, I had 4 new pages in the composition notebook and the clearest picture of Langford Estate I'd had since this whole thing began. I sat in the shop afterward and looked at those pages until my phone buzzed on the workbench. Unknown number. I almost let it go. "Hank?" A woman's voice, tense and low. "This is Wanda Feeney." I said nothing for a moment. "Wanda Feeney, Carol's sister. Carol's closest ally, the woman who took your side before she knew what the argument was." "Wanda," I said carefully, "what can I do for you?" "I need to see you, in person, tomorrow." "You want to tell me what this is about first?" A pause. When she spoke again, her voice had dropped lower, like someone checking over their shoulder. "I've been backing Carol up in all of this. I knew what she was planning, and I didn't say anything to you. I'm not going to pretend otherwise." Another pause. "But something happened last week, and I can't keep doing what I've been doing." Something shifted in my chest. Not warmth, more like the feeling of a board you've been pushing against that suddenly gives. "The corner cafe on the Carthage Square," I said. "Tomorrow, 9 o'clock. Corner table. She was already seated when I arrived, coffee in front of her, untouched. Wanda was 52, dark-haired like Carol, but without Carol's composure, she wore everything on her face, whether she wanted to or not. That morning, her face was carrying something heavy. I sat down across from her and waited. She pulled her phone from her jacket and set it on the table between us, screen up. 8 months of messages, she said. Carol and Garrett. She forwarded me updates along the way. I don't know why. Maybe she needed a witness. She pushed the phone toward me. I want you to have them. I looked at the phone, then at Wanda. What changed? Her jaw tightened. My daughter Emma started at Langford Estate last month. Part-time event setup, extra Christmas money. Garrett invited her to dinner twice. Her voice went flat, in the way voices go when a person is controlling something that wants to come out loud. She's 24 years old, Hank. The same thing he did to Brynn, he was starting it with Emma. The coffee shop was warm and smelled like cinnamon. I looked at Wanda Feeney, the woman who had known for 8 months what was being done to my family, and had stayed quiet and understood something about how patterns work. They keep going until they touch someone close enough to matter. Wanda, I said, did Carol know about Brynn? The silence lasted 3 full seconds. She found out in October, Wanda said quietly. Garrett convinced her it was handled, that it didn't change anything between them. She looked at her untouched coffee. I think part of her knew what he was from the beginning and chose not to look directly at it. I sat with the weight of that. The particular grief of knowing that the woman you'd spent 30 years with had learned her partner was targeting your daughter and had decided to look away. What do you need from me? Wanda asked. Send the messages to this address. I wrote it on a napkin, the private account Carol knew nothing about. All of them. She took the napkin and folded it. Hank. She finally looked at me directly. I'm sorry. I should have come to you sooner. You're here now, I said. That's what matters. I drove back to the shop with 8 months of Carol Garrett messages, on their way to my private email, and a clear understanding of how many people had known what was happening inside my marriage before I did. I sat with that for exactly as long as it was useful. Then I moved on. Buddy called 2 days later. You know the name Cheryl Dunst? He asked. No. Kentucky, Hardin County. She and Garrett had a relationship that ended in 2019, right around the time the harassment complaint got filed and withdrawn. She's been working with a reporter at the Carthage Courier for 4 months. Name of Amber Yates. A pause. They've been missing a piece. Cheryl wants to meet you. She's driving up this weekend. We met at a diner outside Nashville. Buddy, me, and Cheryl Dunst, who arrived exactly on time and looked like a woman who had been waiting 6 years for a conversation she wasn't sure would ever happen. She was 50 years old. Navy coat, dark hair going silver. She sat down, ordered black coffee, and looked me straight in the eyes before saying a word. Then she set her right hand flat on the table. On her ring finger, a silver band. Simple, delicate. An initial engraved on the face. The letter G. He gave it to me in 2018, she said. Told me he'd had it made. That it was just for me. She turned her hand slightly. I found out later he ordered them from a jeweler in Brentwood. Same ring, same engraving. At least 6 of them over the years. I thought of Brynn's hand on the cabin porch railing in the photograph. I thought of Carol's bathroom shelf. 12 years, Cheryl said. 8 women I can name. Everyone connected to land or property or a business access he wanted. Everyone got the ring. Everyone believed she was different. She leaned forward. Amber and I have the pattern and my testimony and 2 other women willing to speak. What we don't have is current evidence. Active documentation from an ongoing situation. I have it, I said. Photographs, financial records, testimony from inside the estate. A USB with 17 photographs and 3 videos. I paused. My daughter is in some of those photographs. Something crossed Cheryl's face, a brief flash of genuine sorrow. I'm sorry, she said. I know, I said. Tell me about Amber Yates. She's careful and she's thorough, and Garrett already tried to shut her down once and it didn't take. Cheryl wrapped both hands around her cup. When this goes public, Hank Garrett loses the ability to settle anything in the dark. Every legal move he makes, every check he tries to write, every NDA, it all happens in daylight. That's what I want, I said. I drove back to Smith County with Cheryl's numbers saved under a name Carol wouldn't recognize, and the feeling of a man who has stopped gathering evidence alone and started building something with other people. She came on a Thursday evening without calling first. A compact car I didn't recognize on the gravel. A woman in her mid-30s got out. No camera, no recorder visible. Hands in her coat pockets. She looked at the shop window where I was standing as if she'd known I was there. I opened the door before she could knock. "Amber Yates," I said. "Mr. Merritt." She looked at me the way someone looks when they've been lied to by professionals and have learned to take the measure of a person before deciding anything. "I know you've been expecting me." "Come in," I said. She stepped inside, stood near the door, looked around the shop with genuine attention, then looked at me. "I've been investigating Garrett Langford for 2 years," she said. "In 2023, his attorney sent a letter to my editor threatening defamation. My editor pulled the story." Her voice was flat and factual. I didn't stop. I just got quieter. "What do you have?" I asked. "The pattern. 6 years of documentation. Cheryl on record 2 anonymous sources, Howard Bliss's financial testimony through back channels." She paused. "What I need is current evidence. Something that proves this is happening right now, not just a pattern from the past." I looked at her a long moment. "You're not recording this." I turned my phone off before I got out of the car. She held my gaze. "I can show you if you want." "I believe you." I gestured to the stool. "Sit down." She sat. I leaned against the workbench. "If I give you what I have," I said, "what happens to my daughter?" She took the question seriously. Didn't rush past. It didn't give me a rehearsed answer. "Brynn would only be identified if she chooses to speak for herself," she said. "I won't use her name or her image without her permission. The story is about Garrett Langford's conduct over 12 years. She's a victim of that conduct, not a subject of the story." A pause. "When this runs Hank, he loses the ability to make problems disappear quietly. For your divorce, for Brynn, for every woman he's done this to sunlight is the only thing that actually works." I thought about Carol's blue notebook, about the church group chat, about Curtis Aldridge telling Gene Whitaker that loyalty goes a long way. "I'll make you coffee," I said. "Then I'll tell you everything." She almost smiled. "I take it black." We talked for 3 hours. When she left at 11, her recorder turned on with my full knowledge, and consent halfway through had everything. I stood in the shop doorway and watched her taillights disappear and felt a door opening that had been closed a long time. I wrote it at 4 in the morning on a Wednesday at the kitchen table before Carol's alarm went off. Not an email. A letter by hand on plain notebook paper in the careful block printing I use when I want something read clearly. Tammy Rhodes, Hardin County, Kentucky. She'd signed a confidentiality agreement with Garrett's attorneys in 2019, $180,000, in exchange for silence. As far as anyone knew, she was still keeping it. I wasn't asking her to break the agreement. I wrote that in the first paragraph clearly. I wasn't asking for testimony or documentation or anything that would expose her legally. I was asking her to confirm through whatever protected channel her own attorney could arrange one thing: that the agreement existed, that she had signed it, that it had been real. 3 paragraphs, my full name, Gene Whitaker's address, as the return Gene had agreed to this without asking too many questions, which was one of the things I valued most about him. I sealed the envelope and drove to the post office when it opened at 6 before Carol was out of the shower. On the drive back down Millstone Road in the early dark, I thought about Tammy Rhodes, a woman I had never met, who had signed a piece of paper 6 years ago and had probably spent every day since carrying the weight of staying quiet. I understood something about carrying weight quietly. I hoped she could feel somewhere in Kentucky that she wasn't carrying it alone anymore. Bev called at 2:15 on a Tuesday afternoon. "Howard Bliss called my office directly," she said, her voice sharper than usual. 3 years of Langford Estate financial records. He'll provide everything in exchange for documented legal protection. I set the router down. What changed his mind? Garrett is preparing to shift financial liability onto Howard for the fraudulent winery accounts. Howard found out yesterday, and he's not waiting to be made the scapegoat. I heard her pen moving. He has wire fraud documentation across state lines, 7 land transactions routed through a shell company in Memphis, payments to at least 6 women over 5 years. A pause. Including Carol, Hank, and Brynn. The shop went very quiet. "Total?" I asked. Estimated 2.1 million in fraudulent transactions over 3 years, Bev said. Combined with the winery licensing violations, this isn't civil anymore. This is federal. I stood at the workbench and looked at the drawer channel I'd been routing. Clean, precise, exactly the right width. What does this mean for the divorce proceedings? It means the picture changed significantly. A pause. Are you prepared for what comes next? Garrett's attorneys will come at every person involved. I looked around the shop. The tools on the wall, the floor safe behind the wall panel, where 3 patents sat in a manila envelope untouched. Bev, I said, I'm a carpenter. I've been preparing things to last my whole life. A brief silence. All right then, she said. I'll be in touch. I put the phone down and stood in the shop a long time. $2.1 million. Carol's name in a ledger she never knew existed. And Garrett Langford standing at the center of it all. A man who had never once considered that the thing he'd been building for 12 years might one day be built against him. I wasn't there when it happened. Brynn came back to the house on a Saturday afternoon in early December to pick up winter clothes, a coat, boots, a sweater she'd been missing since Thanksgiving. Carol wasn't home. She let herself in, went upstairs, found what she came for. Then she used Carol's bathroom because the one in her old room had a slow drain. The ring was on the edge of the sink. Small silver simple. An initial engraved on the face, the letter G. Brynn picked it up, the automatic reflex of finding something left out. Held it between 2 fingers under the bathroom light. She had an identical ring on her own right hand, identical down to the engraving, down to the weight of it. She told me later, I kept turning it. Like if I turned it enough times, I'd find something that made it mean something different. There wasn't anything. It meant exactly what it looked like. She set Carol's ring back on the sink edge, sat down on the bathroom floor, stayed there 20 minutes, not crying, just processing the way she's always processed things. In stillness, first in movement, later. When she stood up, she washed her face, dried it on Carol's hand towel, and looked at herself in the mirror. Then she took both rings, hers from her own hand. Carol's from the sink, walked downstairs, and drove straight to Langford Estate. I didn't call you first, she told me later. I should have. But I wasn't thinking about the right move. I was thinking about his face when I put both rings on his desk. Before I tell you what Brynn did when she walked into that office, drop ready in the comments. She had 2 rings in her hand and 30 seconds of pure clarity. What she did next is something I don't think Garrett Langford ever saw coming. Note this story weaves in fictional elements for narrative and educational value. Names and details are coincidental, but what happens next is the kind of moment that stays with you. She walked into his office without knocking. Garrett was at his desk, jacket on, at the center of something he'd built and controlled until 30 seconds ago. Brynn set both rings on the desk in front of him, side by side, identical. She didn't say a word, just looked at him. Garrett looked at the rings, then at Brynn. His face stayed completely composed, the calm of a man who had been in this moment before and knew the sequence of moves. Brynn, he started. Don't say my name right now, she said. Just tell me how long my mother has had that ring. A pause. 14 months. Brynn did the math standing right there. 14 months. Before she'd started at Langford Estate. Before the first tour of the vineyard. The first time he'd said, you have a real eye for this. Brynn, most people don't see what you see. He had known who she was before she walked through the door. You knew I was her daughter before you hired me, she said. Something shifted behind his eyes, not guilt, recalibration. Brynn, if we sit down and talk through this calmly. I'm not sitting down. Her voice was steady and cold and completely clear. I'm leaving, and I'm going to see my father. She picked up both rings from his desk. Garrett stood. Brynn, I really think you should hear me out. I've heard enough, she said, and walked out. She told me she didn't run. Walked the full length of the corridor at normal pace, pushed through the front door, got in her car, and drove out the white-fenced gravel drive without once looking in the rearview mirror. She cried for the first 10 minutes on the highway. Then she stopped. She had somewhere to be. She pulled into my driveway at 7 o'clock. I heard her car on the gravel and reached over and turned off the belt sander. In the sudden quiet, I could hear my own heartbeat. She stood in the doorway with both rings in her closed fist. The shop light caught the side of her face. She'd been crying recently. I could see the dried tracks, but she wasn't crying now. She was standing straight. Her eyes were clear. She walked to the workbench and opened her hand. Both rings rolled onto the wood under the light. You already knew, she said, not an accusation, just an understanding arriving. Since October, I said. Why didn't you tell me? Because I didn't know how to do it without breaking something before I knew how to help put it back together. I looked at her steadily. That was the wrong call. I'm sorry. She was quiet a moment. Then she pulled the other stool close and sat. How much do you know? Most of it. The pattern. The other women. The ring, it's not custom, Brynn. He orders them in quantity from a jeweler in Brentwood. Same ring, same engraving, different women. She closed her eyes for just a second. When she opened them, something had released the last thing she'd been holding on to. He knew who I was before I started working there, she said. Yes. He hired me because of who I was. Yes. Because of you, because of the land. That's right. She looked at the 2 rings on the workbench, then up at me, the expression I'd last seen when she was 9 years old, and had found out the dog wasn't coming back from the vet. The expression of someone understanding that something they thought was permanent isn't. Dad. Her voice broke just once, just for a moment. I believed him. I genuinely... I know, I said. He's been doing this for 12 years. The fact that it worked on you doesn't say anything about you. It says everything about him. She pressed her lips together, nodded once. I stood up and put my hand on her shoulder. Same gesture I'd made when she was 9, when she was 16, when she was 26, and the engagement had ended, and she'd slept on our couch for 2 months. Not fixing it, just there. She let out a long, shaking breath. Then she straightened, wiped her face with the back of her hand. What do you need from me? She said. That right there was my daughter, coming apart and putting herself back together in the same breath. Right now, nothing. Just be somewhere safe. I paused. Noah Slade tried to warn you in September. She looked at the floor. I know. He's been helping me. He's a good man. Something moved across her face, complicated, layered. Yeah, she said finally. I think he is. We sat in the shop until 9:30. Before she left, she looked at the 2 rings still on the workbench. Keep them, I said. They're evidence. She picked them up. What are you going to do with all of this, Dad? What I always do, I said. Build something that lasts. Bev called at 7:30 on a Sunday morning. I have something, she said. Can you come in today? I'm on my way. Her office was quiet on a Sunday, the square outside empty. Papers spread across her desk. Title records, the 2019 refinance documents, my surgical intake paperwork from December 2018. 2 things, she said. First, the power of attorney you signed in January 2019. Your signature was notarized on January 14th. Your surgical records showed general anesthesia on January 12th and a follow-up sedative procedure on January 13th. Discharge January 14th. I looked at the papers. You signed a power of attorney on the day you were discharged from 2 days of anesthesia, Bev said. Cognitive impairment is documented in your own medical records. That document may be legally worthless. I sat with that. The house, I said, goes back to joint property, cannot be sold without your consent. The Prudhomme listing was unauthorized. Lyle Prudhomme has significant legal exposure. He'll cooperate to protect himself. She slid a second paper across. Second, the 3 acres from your father. Direct deed transfer in 2003, father to son, by will clear documentation. It was never incorporated into joint marital property. Carol's attorneys built their entire financial strategy around those acres being divisible. They're not. They never were. I looked at the 2 papers on the desk. Carol and Garrett and Miriam Tuck had spent 18 months building a plan on 2 assumptions that were wrong. How soon can you move? I asked. She allowed herself a brief, precise smile. I already started this morning. That's why I called it 7:30. She gathered the papers. When Carol gets served with the motion to void the power of attorney, she'll know you've been preparing. Whatever front you've been maintaining. I know, I said. It ends. Yes, she said. It ends. I drove back on Route 70 in the December morning. The fields, frost-covered the ridge, bare against a white sky. Carol and Garrett had built something careful and deliberate, and 18 months in the making, and they had built it on ground that wouldn't hold. I had been building things for 30 years. I know what happens when the foundation is wrong. I put the truck in the driveway, walked into the shop, and looked at the new table taking shape on the workbench. The joints were right. The wood was sound. Some things are and some things aren't. Now everybody was about to find out which was which. It ended on a Sunday evening. Carol came home at 6:15 and found Brynn sitting at the kitchen table with both rings on the surface in front of her, not in her hands. Just there, side by side, under the overhead light, exactly where Carol would see them the moment she walked through the door. I wasn't in the house. Brynn had asked me not to be, and I respected that. She said this was a conversation she needed to have, alone, woman to woman, daughter to mother, without her father in the room to absorb the temperature of it. So I was in the shop with the door cracked and my hands not doing anything useful. Brynn told me everything afterward. I'm going to tell it the way she told me in her words, in her order, the way it happened. Carol walked in, set her purse on the counter, and turned to say something ordinary. Then she saw Brynn. Then she saw the rings. She stopped. Brynn, her voice was careful, controlled. Sit down, Mom. Not a request. Carol sat. Brynn pushed both rings across the table. How long? Carol looked at her own ring on the table in front of her, then at Brynn. Something moved across her face. Not guilt exactly, more like the face of a person watching something they built begin to come apart and understanding there is nothing left to do but watch. 14 months, she said. Brynn stared at her. 14 months. She repeated it slowly, like she was measuring it. So before I started working there, before he interviewed me, before the first time he told me I had a real eye for the place. Carol said nothing. He knew who I was, Mom. Before I walked through the door. You understand what that means? Brynn's voice rose not out of control, but with the force of something that had been compressed too long. He didn't find me by accident. He found me because of you, and you let it happen. Brynn, it's not... Don't tell me it's complicated. Brynn pushed back from the table, stood. I spent 4 months believing that man actually saw something real in me. 4 months. You knew what he was the whole time, and you said nothing. I didn't know he was going to... Carol stopped. What? Going to what, Mom? Going to do to me. Exactly what he was doing to you because that's what happened. Brynn's voice broke on the last word, not collapsing, just cracking the sound of something under enormous pressure finding the fault line. Did you know about the ring? A long silence. I found out in October, Carol said quietly. October. Brynn laughed, once short, sharp, the laugh that isn't really a laugh. That's 2 months ago. 2 months you knew he'd given me the same ring he gave you, and you still said nothing. She picked up both rings from the table. Were you ever going to tell me, or was I just collateral? Something you'd deal with after the divorce was done and the money was settled? Carol's face had gone very still. That's not fair. Which part isn't fair? Brynn said. Tell me which part. Carol looked at the table. Her hands were flat on the surface, and they were not entirely steady. I made choices, she said finally. Wrong ones. I know that. Do you... Brynn looked at her mother for a long moment, the kind of look that takes inventory of 30 years and finds it coming up short. Because you don't look like someone who knows that. You look like someone who got caught. She picked up both rings, walked to the back door, and pushed it open, threw both rings into the dark of the yard. Brynn told me she heard one of them hit the wooden slat of the porch railing, and the other disappear silently into the dead grass. Then she walked out, without looking back. Carol didn't follow her. Brynn called me from her car at 9 o'clock. I heard her breathing before she could say anything. I went inside, started the kettle, and waited. When she knocked on the shop door 20 minutes later, I already had 2 cups made. We sat in the shop until midnight, and we didn't talk the whole time, which was exactly right. Travis called me on a Tuesday night, 3 days after Brynn's confrontation with Carol. Dad, he said, I'm coming down. I didn't argue. Went on. Thursday morning, I'll be there by noon. He was there at 11:45. I heard his truck on the gravel and went out to meet him. He was 26 years old, and he looked like me at that age. Same build, same deliberate way of moving, same face that didn't give much away until you knew where to look. He got out of the truck, and we stood in the driveway for a moment. You look tired, he said. I'm all right, I said. That's not the same thing. I almost smiled. Come in. I'll make coffee. We sat at the kitchen table, the small one, not the oak table, and I told him everything from the beginning, all of it in order. He listened the way he's always listened, completely still. No expression changes, no interruptions. When I finished, the coffee was cold. He sat with it for a moment. Then, How long have you been carrying this alone? Since October, I said. That's 2 months, Dad. I know. He looked at me with something I didn't quite know how to receive, not pity, not anger, something closer to the feeling of a person who has just understood something about someone they love that they should have understood sooner. You should have called me in October. I know, I said. I didn't want to pull you into it before I had something solid. I'm your son, he said. You don't need something solid to call me. I looked at him across the table. Travis had always been the quiet one, the one who showed up and stayed and didn't require a lot of words. He was showing up now, and I was grateful in a way I didn't have the language for, which is usually how it goes with the things that matter most. Are you okay? He asked. And I mean that, actually. Not managing, not functioning okay. I thought about it honestly. I'm better than I expected to be, I said. The hard part isn't what happened. The hard part is what it means about the last 30 years. Whether any of it was what I thought it was. Travis was quiet a moment. The table you made, he said. The oak one. Does it matter that she sat at it too? Does that make it less yours? I looked at him. You built it, he said simply. You built everything. That's real regardless of what she did. We sat in silence for a while. Good silence, the kind between two people who don't need to fill it. He stayed 3 weeks. Every morning he was up before I was coffee, already made, sitting at the kitchen table reading, or just quiet. He came into the shop and handed me tools without being asked. He drove into Carthage to pick up supplies and didn't ask for reimbursement. He was just there in the steady, reliable way of someone who understands that presence is its own kind of language. On his last morning before he loaded his truck, I brought him out to the shop. The oak table from the dining room was standing near the side wall. I'd moved it out 3 days earlier, after thinking about it for a week. Travis looked at it, then at me. I want you to take it, I said. He didn't say anything for a moment. He walked over and ran his hand along the surface the way I'd taught him to, following the grain feeling the work. Dad, I'm building a new one, I said. It's already started. The old one should be somewhere it means something to someone. He stood there with his hand on the table, and I saw something move across his face that he didn't try to hide. He looked up. Thank you, he said. Load it carefully, I said. It's 30 years old. I know what it is, he said. He drove out at 9 in the morning with the oak table strapped in the truck bed, and I stood in the driveway and watched him go and felt something release in my chest. Not loss, but something adjacent to it that was also somehow a relief. Amber called on a Friday afternoon while I was sanding the new table base. I have a new witness, she said. Her name is Lena Kowalski, 24 years old, former packing employee at Langford Estate. She was fired in August. Why? I asked. She refused Garrett. Amber's voice was controlled but tight. He made an approach. She said no. She was let go 2 weeks later for what the termination letter called performance issues. She's been quiet since August because she needed the reference and was afraid. A pause. She came forward this week after Cheryl Dunst agreed to go on record. Seeing someone else stand up made it possible for her to stand up. What does she have? Testimony about at least 4 other women inside the estate over the past 2 years. A pattern of approaches, escalation, and termination, or forced resignation when women didn't comply, or when Garrett decided they were no longer useful. Amber paused again. Hank, this isn't a story about your marriage anymore. This is a story about a systematic pattern of predatory behavior that has been running for over a decade inside a business that employs people from this community. I set the sanding block down. How many women total, I asked, that I can document by name with their knowledge and consent? 11. She let that sit a moment. Lena said something when I interviewed her that I want you to hear. She said, and I'm quoting directly, I thought I was the only one. I thought it was something about me specifically that made it happen. Finding out it was everyone, finding out it was a system that was both the worst thing and the most relieving thing I've ever learned. I stood in the shop and looked at the table base on the workbench. The joints clean, the wood sound. When are you running it? I asked. I'm ready when you give me the final confirmation that I can use the documentation you provided, she said. The USB files, the financial records from Howard, the messages Wanda forwarded. You have my confirmation, I said. Then I'm going to press editor on Friday morning, she said. It runs Saturday, front page. Amber, I said. Yeah? Thank you for not stopping in 2023. A brief silence. Thank you for opening the shop door, she said. I put the phone down and stood in the shop in the December afternoon light and thought about Lena Kowalski, 24 years old, fired from a job she needed because she said no to a man who was used to not hearing it. I thought about all 11 of them. I picked up the sanding block and went back to work. The preliminary hearing was December 17th. Bev had told me what to expect, and it unfolded almost exactly as she described. The difference between knowing something is coming and experiencing it is the temperature of it, the particular cold of sitting in a wood-paneled courtroom in Smith County while your marriage is reduced to line items on a legal pad. Carol sat at the opposing table with Miriam Tuck. She was dressed carefully, the navy blazer she wore to important things. She looked composed. She did not look at me when I came in. I sat beside Bev and put my hands flat on the table and waited. Bev presented 3 points in sequence without drama, the way a carpenter drives nails, clean, efficient, one at a time. Point 1. The 2019 power of attorney, signed on the day of discharge from 2 days of anesthesia. Medical records attached. Legal precedent cited. The document was being challenged as invalid. Miriam Tuck objected. The judge listened to both sides, asked 3 questions, made a note. Point 2. The 3 acres transferred by direct deed from father to son in 2003, predating the joint property agreement. Documentation attached. The acres were not part of the divisible marital estate. Miriam Tuck objected again. The judge looked at the deed transfer documentation for a long time. Point 3. $99,000 transferred from joint accounts over 11 months to an unidentified external account. Evidence of asset dissipation. Request for full accounting and potential reversal. Miriam Tuck said, Your Honor, my client disputes. The judge held up one hand. The room went quiet. I've reviewed the documentation, the judge said. I'm issuing a temporary freeze on all disputed assets pending full review. The power of attorney question will require a separate hearing. The property listing currently active on Millstone Road is suspended effective immediately pending title clarification. He set his pen down. We'll schedule the follow-up for January. He stood. The room stood. I looked at the table in front of me, the wood grain running straight and even under the fluorescent light. Across the room, Miriam Tuck leaned close to Carol and said something in a low voice. I watched Carol's face, the composure still there, but something underneath it had shifted. The expression of a person whose plan has just encountered something it wasn't built to handle. She looked up. For the first time since I'd walked in, she looked directly at me. I didn't look away. I didn't give her anything to read. I just held the look until she turned back to her attorney. Bev touched my arm lightly as we walked out. That's the beginning, she said quietly. Not the end, but the beginning. I know, I said. I'll take it. We walked out of the courthouse into the December afternoon. The square was quiet. The Bradford pears stripped bare, the sky the color of old pewter. I stood on the courthouse steps for a moment and breathed cold air and felt not triumph, not relief exactly, something more like the feeling of a foundation test that comes back clean. The structure will hold. That was enough for now. The Carthage Courier ran the story on Saturday morning. I was in the shop at 6 when Amber texted, It's up. Print and digital, both. Nashville, Tennessean picked it up by 7. I didn't look at my phone after that for a while. I made coffee, went back to the table base, ran a hand plane across the surface, and listened to the sound of it, the clean whisper of sharp steel on straight grain. At 8:30 I drove to the gas station on Route 70 and bought a print copy. Sat in the truck in the parking lot and read it from the first line to the last. Pattern of predation, how a Smith County winery owner targeted women and land for 12 years. Amber had written it the way it was clean, factual, documented. No speculation, no embellishment. Just the pattern named and sourced and placed in chronological order. Cheryl Dunst named and quoted. Lena Kowalski named and quoted. 2 other women quoted anonymously. Howard Bliss's financial documentation summarized. The winery licensing violations. The shell company in Memphis. The silver rings. My name was not in the story. Brynn's name was not in the story. Carol's name was not in the story. The story was about Garrett Langford. By 9 o'clock, according to Buddy, who called while I was still in the gas station parking lot, the Tennessee Alcoholic Beverage Commission just announced a formal review of Langford Estates' operating license. It's on their website. By noon, Amber texted that the federal prosecutor's office in Nashville had issued a statement confirming awareness of the reporting and an ongoing review. By 5 o'clock, Curtis Aldridge had submitted his resignation from Langford Estate, and according to Noah, who called from the estate, had loaded his personal belongings and driven off the property before lunch. I read each piece of news in the shop alone with a cup of coffee that went cold while I was thinking. I didn't feel triumphant. I want to be honest about that. What I felt was something quieter and more complicated. The feeling of a long piece of work finally reaching the stage, where you can see its shape, where the structure is visible, even though the finishing isn't done. It wasn't celebration. It was something closer to the specific satisfaction of knowing the joints are true and the wood is sound, and what you've built will stand. My phone rang most of the day. I didn't answer most of it. That evening I stood in the shop in the quiet, after the calls had stopped, and looked at the new table taking shape on the workbench. I thought about Garrett Langford, 55 years old, 300 acres of Tennessee vineyard, going dormant in the January cold, spending $850 an hour on attorneys to fight a system he had spent 12 years defrauding. I thought some things you build last, and some things, when they fall, fall completely. I picked up my chisel and went back to work. January came cold and gray. Buddy called on a Thursday morning while I was fitting drawer slides. "You want the rundown," he said. "Go ahead," I said. Tennessee Alcoholic Beverage Commission suspended Langford Estates' operating license, pending investigation that happened January 3rd. The federal preliminary inquiry into wire fraud and financial fraud was confirmed January 8th by the U.S. Attorney's Office in Nashville. A pause. Greg Whitfield, the shell company man in Memphis, voluntarily presented himself to federal investigators January 10th to avoid being charged as a principal. Curtis Aldridge has not been located. The estate has been closed to the public since the license suspension. I looked out the shop window. The fields along the back of the property were gray and frost-covered, the trees stripped bare. "What about Garrett himself?" I asked. "Retained 2 attorneys from a Nashville firm at $850 an hour each," Buddy said. "Filed a motion to dismiss the federal inquiry on procedural grounds. Got denied January 11th. A brief silence. "He's fighting it, Hank. He has money, and he'll use all of it. This isn't over." "I know," I said. "You doing all right?" I thought about the question honestly. "Yeah," I said. "I am." "Good," Buddy said. "That's what I wanted to hear." After I hung up, I stood at the workbench and looked at the drawer slides in my hands, 2 simple pieces of hardware engineered to move smoothly under load to bear weight without binding. Simple, functional, reliable. I thought about Garrett Langford burning through $850 an hour to fight a system he'd built his entire operation by circumventing. There was something in that, not justice, exactly not yet, but the shape of it beginning to emerge from the wood. I put the drawer slides in and tested them. They moved perfectly. I went to the next one. The call came through Bev's office on January 8th. I was sitting across from her desk when her phone rang. She'd asked me to come in that morning for a routine update on the freeze motion. She glanced at the display, and something in her expression shifted slightly. "Excuse me," she said. She picked up, listened for 45 seconds without speaking. Then, "I understand. Thank you. Yes, I'll let him know." She hung up. She looked at me across the desk. "That was an attorney in Hardin County, Kentucky," she said, "representing a client whose name I'm not going to say out loud in this office." "I understand," I said. "Her client cannot speak directly due to the terms of an existing agreement," Bev said carefully. "However, her client's attorney is prepared to provide a notarized statement confirming the existence of that agreement, the conditions under which it was signed, and the approximate financial terms without identifying the specific parties by name in the public record." She paused. "It also confirms that the agreement contained a non-disparagement clause that her client signed under what her attorney describes as significant time pressure and emotional duress." I sat across from Bev and looked at the survey map of Smith County on the wall behind her. Every property line drawn in thin black ink, every boundary named and measured. Combined with Howard Bliss's documentation and the testimony already on record, Bev said, "This completes the pattern. Not just a pattern, alleged a pattern evidenced across time, across state lines, across at least 3 documented instances of financial coercion." "Will it hold in federal court?" I asked. "That's for the federal attorneys to determine," she said. "But my assessment? Yes, it will hold." I nodded slowly. "Hank?" Bev set her pen down and looked at me with the directness she reserved for things that mattered. "The woman in Kentucky, she stayed quiet for 6 years. That took a toll. Whatever she decides to do from here, the fact that she answered your letter says something." "I know," I said quietly. "You gave her a way to do something without destroying herself to do it," Bev said. "That was the right instinct." I looked at the map on the wall, every boundary named, every property measured and recorded. "Bev," I said, "when does the divorce hearing get scheduled?" She picked her pen back up. "January 15th, she said. 10 days. I drove home on Route 70 in the January morning, the sky low and white, the ridge barely visible through the haze. 10 days. I had been building toward this for 3 months, the way I build everything, one joint at a time, one measurement at a time, checking each piece before moving to the next. 10 days. The structure was ready. I put the truck in the driveway, went to the shop, and looked at the new table. Almost done. Almost done turned out to mean 10 more days of waiting. The mediation was scheduled for January 15th, in a Nashville office building, neutral ground, which meant nobody's territory, which meant everybody was equally uncomfortable. I drove up with Bev in her car. She talked through the sequence of what would happen, what to expect, what not to react to. I listened and watched the winter fields go by on either side of Interstate 40. "One more thing," she said as we pulled into the parking garage. "Carol may try to speak to you directly at some point during the break. She's done it before with other clients. Goes around the attorneys to create an emotional moment that can shift the dynamic." "What do you want me to do if that happens?" I asked. "Nothing," Bev said. "Be polite, be brief, give her nothing to work with." I nodded. We went inside. The mediation room was on the 4th floor. A long table, neutral gray walls, a window overlooking a parking structure. Not designed to make anyone comfortable. I sat beside Bev. Carol sat across from me beside Miriam Tuck, who was precise and composed, and had clearly done this 100 times. Carol was wearing the navy blazer again. She looked tired in a way she was working hard not to show. She didn't look at me when I sat down. Miriam Tuck opened. Her position was measured and professional. Carol's contributions to the marriage, the financial interdependence, the expected division of joint assets. She spoke for 12 minutes without interruption. Then Bev spoke. She laid the 3 documents on the table in sequence. The 2019 power of attorney, challenged and supported by the medical records, showing post-anesthesia impairment on the date of signing. The 3 acres direct deed transfer, predating the joint property agreement, never incorporated into the marital estate. The $99,000 documented transfers to an external account over 11 months, constituting asset dissipation under Tennessee law. Miriam Tuck said, "We dispute the characterization of the power of attorney signing conditions." Bev said, "The medical records are from your client's own doctor. The discharge summary is co-signed by the attending anesthesiologist. I'm happy to subpoena both physicians if the characterization is in dispute." Silence. The mediator looked at both sides. "I'd like to take a 15-minute break," he said. During the break, I stood at the window and looked at the parking structure. Bev was on her phone. I could hear from across the room the low, urgent conversation between Carol and Miriam Tuck. Not the words, just the tone. The tone of a strategy being rapidly reassessed. Carol appeared at my elbow. I turned. She was standing close, which she'd calculated, and her voice was low. "Hank," she paused, "I want you to know that whatever happens today, I didn't want it to be like this." I looked at her. The woman I had driven to the ER at 2 in the morning. The woman who had sat across from me at the oak table for 30 years. The woman who had written, "He is the exit," in a blue notebook she'd hidden in a hatbox on the top shelf of our closet. "I know," I said. That was all. She waited for more. I didn't give her more. Bev appeared at my shoulder. "They're ready to resume," she said smoothly, and Carol stepped back to her side of the table. The final terms took 40 minutes to negotiate. The house reverted to joint property. The 2019 power of attorney declared invalid by mutual agreement to avoid a full court challenge. The $99,000 was counted against Carol's share of the joint assets, which meant her net settlement was reduced by that amount. The 3 acres remained mine, entirely removed from the calculation. The patents which Miriam Tuck had never known existed, and which were never entered into evidence, remained untouched, unmentioned, intact. Carol signed. She held the pen for a moment before she touched it to the page, just a moment, the pause of a person at the edge of something they can't come back from. Then she signed. She did not look at me when she signed. I looked at the table surface, the wood grain running straight and even under the fluorescent light. Some things hold, some things don't. Today we were just documenting which was which. I walked out of the mediation office into the January afternoon and stood on the sidewalk outside the building. Bev came out a moment later and stood beside me. Neither of us said anything for a moment. Then she said, "That's done." And I said, "Yes." And that was exactly enough. She called 2 days later on a Thursday evening while I was fitting the final stretcher on the new table. "Dad." Her voice was different from the last time, lighter, somehow, or not lighter exactly, but less compressed, like something that had been held under pressure had finally been allowed to find its own level. "Hey," I said. I set the stretcher down and sat on the stool. "I just wanted to call and check on you," she said. "Not about anything specific. Just how are you doing?" I thought about the question honestly, the way Travis had asked me to. "I'm good," I said. "Actually good. Not managing. Good." "Yeah." She sounded like she believed it, which meant she could hear the difference. "Yeah," I said. "The table's almost done. The new one. I've been working on it since December." "What kind of wood?" "Oak again. Tennessee oak, same county as the original. The grain's tighter than what I used the first time the tree was older." "So it'll be better," she said. "Different," I said. "Better in some ways, just different." A pause. Then Noah says hi. I smiled at that. A real one, not the kind I'd been producing for show for 3 months. "Tell him I said thanks. For everything." "I will." Another pause, softer this time. "Dad, I want to come home. Not for a reason. Not for a crisis. Just to come home." Something moved in my chest, warm and uncomplicated, the way feelings rarely are anymore. "Come this weekend," I said. "I'll make chili." She laughed the real laugh low and opened the one I hadn't heard in too long. "I'll be there Saturday." "Bring Noah if you want," I said. "There's enough chili." A brief silence. "Yeah," she said quietly. "I think I will." After I hung up, I sat on the stool for a moment. The shop was warm and smelled of fresh oak and Danish oil. Outside, the January night was cold and still. I picked up the stretcher and went back to fitting it. The joint was clean. The wood was sound. I kept working. The signing was January 20th. In Bev's office, neutral ground again, though this time it felt different. This time, I had chosen the ground. The representative from the Nashville Furniture Company was a man named Gerald Whitmore, early 50s, good suit, the manner of someone who had been in many negotiations and had learned to read a room quickly. He'd been waiting 18 months for this call, and he didn't let it show, which I appreciated. We sat across from each other with Bev beside me and a stack of papers between us. "Mr. Merritt," Gerald said, setting his pen down before picking it up again, "I want to say the technique in these patents is genuinely exceptional. We've had 3 engineers analyze the joinery method, and none of them could replicate it independently. Whatever you did to develop this, it was not obvious." 15 years, I said. He looked at me. "It shows." "The terms are the same as the 2023 offer," I asked Bev. $380,000, she said. 3 installments over 18 months. Non-exclusive license, you retain full ownership of the patents and the right to license to additional parties. "Then I'm ready," I said. I signed. The pen moved across the page in my block, printing the same handwriting I'd used to write the first line of the composition notebook back in October. October 17th, 2025. 4 months ago. A different man in the same handwriting. Gerald Whitmore shook my hand. "It's a pleasure doing business with you," he said. "If you ever consider an exclusive arrangement, we'd be very interested in the conversation." "I'll keep it in mind," I said. After he left, Bev and I sat in her office for a moment. She was making notes on her legal pad. The afternoon light came through the window at a low winter angle, catching the dust motes in the air. "Bev?" I said. She looked up. "Thank you," I said, "for all of it." She set her pen down. "You did the work, Hank. I just made sure the foundation was documented correctly." I smiled at that. "That's what I do, too." She almost smiled back, full smile, the kind she reserved for things she actually found worth smiling about. "I know," she said. "That's why it worked." I drove home on Route 70 in the low January light and stopped at the Dollar General on the way, the same one where I'd bought the composition notebook 4 months ago, under the same flat fluorescent lights, past the same seasonal aisle now stocking Valentine's Day decorations instead of Christmas ones. I bought a styrofoam coffee from the machine by the door and a cellophane-wrapped cookie I didn't particularly want, and went and sat in the truck in the parking lot. $380,000 arriving in 3 installments, built from 15 years of quiet work in a shop behind a house that nobody had paid particular attention to. Built while I was delivering cabinets and driving Route 70 and being the man who doesn't know anything and never does. I drank the coffee. It was bad the way it always was. I sat in that parking lot for 20 minutes, same lot, same bad coffee, same flat sky, and felt the distance between the man who had sat here in October with a shaking hand and a composition notebook and the man sitting here now. Not a different man. The same man, more clearly himself. I started the truck and drove home. They came the way people come in a small town separately, without coordination, without anyone asking them to. Buddy showed up at the shop on a Tuesday morning with 2 coffees and no agenda. He set one on the workbench beside me and sat on the spare stool and watched me work for 20 minutes without saying much of anything. At one point he said, "Table's looking good." I said, "Getting there." That was the whole conversation, and it was exactly the right conversation. Gene called to place a new order, a set of bathroom vanity doors for his nephew's house in Lebanon. We talked through the specs and the wood selection and the timeline. Before he hung up, he said, "Glad things are settling down for you, Hank." I said, "Me too, Gene." Simple, true. Loretta was standing at her hose reel when I drove past her house one afternoon, pulling it in for the winter, the kind of task that takes longer than it should at 71. I stopped and helped her finish it. She held the door open for me to come in for coffee, and I went in, and we sat at her kitchen table and talked about her granddaughter and the new stop sign and the Bradford pears on the Carthage Square that the county was talking about replacing. Before I left, she stopped me at the door. "You look like yourself again," she said. I thought about that. "I feel like myself," I said. "Maybe more so than before." She tilted her head slightly, the way she does when she's deciding whether to say something. Then she said it. "Sometimes it takes losing the wrong things to figure out which ones were right." I stood in her doorway with the January cold at my back and thought about the oak table in Travis's apartment in Nashville, and the new table in my shop, and the composition notebook in the filing cabinet drawer, and 3 patents in a floor safe that had just become $380,000. "Yeah," I said, "I think that's right." I drove home down Millstone Road in the January afternoon and turned into my own driveway and sat for a moment looking at the house. 4 coats of paint porch, I'd rebuilt windows. I'd reframed 22 years of work in every board and nail and coat of finish. Mine. Clearly and legally and completely mine. I got out of the truck and went into the shop. She called on a Thursday evening at the end of January. I was in the kitchen. I saw her name on the screen and stood there a moment, phone in hand, deciding. I picked up. "Hank?" Her voice was quiet. Not composed. Quiet. Just quiet. The quietness of someone who has put down something heavy and hasn't decided yet how to stand without it. "Carol," I said. A pause. "I'm not calling about the paperwork. Bev and Miriam have all of that." Another pause longer. I wanted to say I'm sorry. Not to explain it or justify it. Just I'm sorry." I stood in the kitchen where we had eaten breakfast together for 22 years. I looked at the counter where she'd left the thermos for me in October, wrapped in a dish towel still warm. I looked at the chair she'd sat in every morning with her first cup of coffee always facing the window. I thought about what I wanted to say. Not what was strategic or protective or wise, just what was true. "I heard you," I said. She waited like she thought more was coming. "That's all I have right now," I said. But I mean it. I heard you. A long silence. When she spoke again, her voice was slightly unsteady at the edges. The first unsteadiness I'd heard from her in 4 months. Okay, she said. That's okay. Take care of yourself, Carol, I said. You too, Hank, she said. I hung up, set the phone on the counter, stood in the kitchen for a moment. I heard you. Not, I forgive you. I wasn't there yet, and I didn't know if I'd get there, and I wasn't going to say it until I meant it. Not, I'm fine, because I was better than fine in some ways and still working through it in others. And both of those things were true simultaneously. Not goodbye, because it wasn't that kind of call. Just I heard you. I picked up the phone and put it in my pocket and went out to the shop. The new table was waiting. I had 2 or 3 hours of finish work left. I turned on the shop light and picked up the Danish oil and a clean cloth and got to work. Outside, the January night was cold and clear and completely quiet. Inside the shop was warm and smelled of oak and oil. It was enough. It was more than enough. The click of the phone on the counter was the last sound of the old life. I stood in the kitchen for a minute, feeling the weight of the silence. It wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence of October. It was the quiet of a house that had finally stopped holding its breath. I walked out to the shop. The January air was a sharp blade against my skin, but inside the heater had kept the scent of oak and oil trapped in a warm embrace. I flipped the switch. The overhead lights hummed to life, pouring yellow warmth over the new table. It was 6 in the morning. The sky outside the shop window was that bruised pre-dawn purple, the frost on the back pasture looking like a shroud of diamonds. I pulled my stool up to the workbench and just looked at the wood. Tennessee white oak. It had a different soul than the cherry cabinet I'd finished back in October. Cherry is romantic. It darkens with age, hiding its secrets. But oak is honest. It's stubborn. It shows you every year of its growth, every winter it survived, every storm that tried to twist it. I picked up a piece of 400 grit sandpaper. My hands calloused and mapped with the scars of 40 years moved across the surface. Morning, Hank, I muttered to myself. The sound of my own voice was a grounding wire. I felt a sudden sharp prick of heat behind my eyes. It wasn't grief for Carol. It was a strange, overwhelming realization of my own hands that they had built a case, saved a daughter, and were now finishing a table. I hadn't just survived the last 4 months. I had measured them. You're doing okay, I whispered, the words catching in my throat. I let the emotion sit there, heavy and real, not pushing it away. For the first time in 30 years, I didn't have to be the man who never gets upset. I could just be a man in a shop, feeling the grain of a new beginning. I reached for the Danish oil. It was time to see what this would really look like. By 8 o'clock, the sun was a thin, pale disk hanging over the ridge. I heard a truck on the gravel. I knew the sound of that Tacoma. I wiped my hands on a shop rag and opened the door. Noah Slade stood there, breath blooming in the cold air, a cardboard carrier of coffee in his hand. Brynn climbed out of the passenger side, wrapped in a heavy wool coat I'd bought her 3 Christmases ago. You're early, I said, a smile tugging at the corners of my mouth. Noah wanted to beat the traffic from Nashville, Brynn said, jogging up to the door and throwing her arms around me. She smelled like the cold outdoors and citrus. She held on a second longer than usual, and I squeezed back. And I wanted to see the table. Coffee's still hot, Mr. Merritt, Noah said, stepping inside. He looked at the table and stopped. He whistled low. That's some tight grain. Is that the white oak from the ridge? It is, I said, taking a coffee cup. Grown slow? That's why the rings are so close together. Makes it harder to work, but it'll hold anything you put on it. Brynn walked around the table, her fingers tracing the edge where the oil was still soaking in. It's beautiful, Dad. It looks different than the one in the dining room. Sturdier. The old one was built by a 28-year-old who thought he knew everything about how a house stayed together, I said, leaning against my workbench. This one was built by a man who actually found out. Noah looked at me, a quiet understanding in his eyes. He'd risked his job and his safety to help a man he barely knew. It's a good piece of work, sir. Solid foundation. Speaking of foundations, I said, looking at Noah, how's the estate? Noah took a sip of his coffee. Quiet. The TABC investigators are there twice a week. Garrett is mostly holed up in the main house with his lawyers. Word is he's trying to sell off 100 acres to cover the legal fees, but with the federal freeze on his shell, companies he can't find a buyer who'll touch it. He's trapped in the house he built. Brynn said, her voice hard but devoid of the bitterness I'd heard in December. She looked at me. Mom called me last night, Dad. The shop went still. I know, I said. She called me too. What did you say to her? I told her I heard her, I said. That's all I had. Brynn nodded, her gaze returning to the oak. I told her I needed time. A lot of it. I told her that just because I understood why she did it doesn't mean I'm ready to sit at a table with her. She looked up at me, her eyes shimmering. Was that the right thing to say? There isn't a blueprint for this, Brynn, I said, reaching out to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear. But honesty's the only wood that doesn't rot. You told her the truth. That's always the right thing. She leaned her head against my shoulder for a moment. I'm glad I'm home. Me too, I said. I looked at Noah. You still like chili, son? Noah grinned. Sir, I've been thinking about your chili since the county line. Good. Give me an hour to finish the top coat on this stretcher. Then we'll go inside. I think Buddy and Loretta might drop by later. A full house, Brynn said, looking around the shop, the tools, the wood, the light. I like the sound of that. I watched them talk near the door, Noah pointing out a specific dovetail joint, and Brynn listening with that focused, bright expression. These were the people who had stood in the gap when the floor dropped out. Buddy with his folders, Loretta with her calendar, Cody with his courage, and Noah with his truth. They were the joints that held my life together now. By noon, the first coat of oil had settled into the oak, turning the pale wood into a rich, deep amber. I stood back and crossed my arms, my head tilted to catch the light. It was perfect. Not because it was flawless. There was a tiny knot near the far leg and a slight variation in color where the heartwood met the sapwood, but because it was real. It was a table that could handle the weight of a family, the spill of coffee, the pounding of a fist in anger, or the resting of a weary head in prayer. Noah and Brynn were already in the house. I could hear the faint sound of the radio playing from the kitchen window. The scent of chili was beginning to drift across the yard, mingling with the smell of the shop. I picked up my sharpest chisel one last time. There was a tiny burr on the underside of the table, something no one would ever see, but I knew it was there. I felt the weight of the tool, the familiar balance of it. I thought about the composition notebook in the drawer. I thought about the $380,000. I thought about the man who had driven Route 70 in October broken and blind. He was gone, but he'd left behind the measurements for the man I was now. I wasn't happy, not in the way people in movies are. I was something better. I was settled. I was a man who knew exactly where his boundaries were, who knew the value of his own hands, and who knew that even when a house is sold and a marriage is broken, the skill of the builder remains. I put the blade to the wood. One clean, decisive stroke. The burr fell away, a single curl of oak landing on the sawdust-covered floor. I ran my thumb over the spot. Smooth. True. I looked out the window. The January light was thin and gray and honest. It didn't hide the cracks in the fence or the bareness of the trees. It showed the world exactly as it was. I placed the chisel back in its rack right where it belonged. I wiped the workbench clean and turned off the shop light. That's it, I whispered into the quiet. I walked out of the shop and toward the house, my boots crunching on the frozen ground. I didn't look back at the winery to the east or the road to the west. I just looked at the light in the kitchen window where my daughter was waiting. I put my hand on the doorknob. I started again. That was enough. That was everything. There's a sign outside Calvary Baptist on Route 70 that I'd driven past 1,000 times without reading. The morning after everything was settled, I finally read it. God sees everything. I used to think that was a warning. Now I know it's a promise. Here's what I learned the hard way, the slow way, the only way a stubborn carpenter from Tennessee learns anything. I spent 30 years building things that would last and forgot to check the foundation I was building on. I noticed the grain in the wood and missed the rot underneath. Don't be like me. Don't wait until your world cracks open to start paying attention. The people around you will show you exactly who they are long before a crisis forces you to see it. The question is whether you're watching. My honest take. A man's real wealth isn't in the bank. It's what remains standing when everything else gets stripped away. My kids showed up. My neighbors showed up. My work held. That's the only inventory that matters when the floor drops out. This is what people call dad revenge. I'd call it something simpler. A man who finally stopped being patient about the wrong things and started being precise about the right ones. The difference between those two things is everything. If this story hits somewhere close to home, drop a comment. Tell me what you've been carrying that maybe it's time to set down. And if someone in your life needs to hear this today, share it. Don't let them sit alone with it the way I did. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Thank you for staying until the very end. It means more than you know. A note: some stories on this channel contain fictional elements built purely for reflection and education. If that's not for you, no hard feelings, choose what serves you best. But if you're still here, I'll see you in the next one.